Okay.
Okay, so welcome to our third seminar of the semester, and today we have the honor of welcoming one of our own very grad students, Dr. Amber Osterholt. She graduated from UNLV in 2019, and since 2023, she's been a senior research specialist at the Center for Clinical and Translational Science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She works to improve equity and accessibility in translation, in translational science, and she also works a lot to engage diverse communities. And today she's presenting her talk titled, The Science of Doing Science, Translation, Team Science, and You. So welcome, help me welcome.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. So as we've already shared, today I'm going to talk about the science of doing science. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Is that better?
You're good. I was just had the volume up a little too loud, but you're doing fine.
Okay, great. So we'll be talking about translation, team science, and how that can impact you. I do hope you'll bear with me and my somewhat frequent sips of water, as I woke up this morning with a bit of a dry and scratchy throat. I've gotten used to relative humidity above 3% in the past 4 years since I moved from Las Vegas, and we've been just a little bit dry here recently. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. The UIC Center for Clinical and Translational Science is supported by the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. I also want to take a moment to recognize that the lands on which we're present today are the traditional birthright of Indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed and who have faced centuries of struggle for survival and identity in the wake of dispossession. So let's take a moment to both offer our gratitude to the land on which we learn and live and work, and also acknowledge our responsibilities to the peoples of this land to address both that history and to let it guide our work in the present and the future. To set the plan for today's talk, I plan to talk for probably about 25 to 30 minutes. I'm going to start out by introducing translational science. So this will include kind of all of the boring definitions, and we'll explore a little bit about how translational science works. I'll use a case study from my own work during the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. As a note, today, most of what I'll be talking about is focused on the clinical side of translational science. But translation and translational science can be approached from other avenues as well. Next, I'll explore how anthropology and translational science can work together. I will give a brief overview of how I went from a bioarchaeology graduate student at UNLV to working in translational science and research administration, and explore the different ways in which anthropologists can do translational science. And then finally, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, since this talk is primarily about some of the ways that you can leverage your MA or PhD in anthropology to do something other than tenure-track faculty. So let's get started with translational science. What is translation exactly? A simple definition for translation is that it's the process of turning observations, both in the laboratory and kind of in our outside laboratory within the community, in the clinic, into interventions that improve the health and well-being of individuals and the public. This includes diagnostics and therapeutics to medical procedures and behavioral changes. And while I said earlier that this talk will feature clinical work heavily, applied anthropological approaches are one way to approach translation. Quote, anthropology put to use, unquote, is one way to think about translation, particularly when I discuss some of the potential career opportunities in clinical and translational science later in this talk. I think for a lot of people, myself included, translation isn't something that we instinctually know about as we set out to do our work. As scientists and researchers, translation is really the goal of the work that we do. We want our work to have an impact in some way, shape, or form for the people that we work with and for. That may include better medications or medical devices to help people live better lives. It may also include providing expert testimony to support changes in policy or procedures. In science generally, as a school of thought, primary means of communication is through scientific journals and scientific conferences, which can be difficult to access for the people with the means to make policy and procedural changes. Translational research and translational science are designed to move research into the hands of these policymakers. So translational research is simply put just the process of taking a discovery from the laboratory into the clinic and beyond through the translational science spectrum. And then finally, translational science is the study of how scientific knowledge moves through the translational science spectrum. The translational science spectrum, as shown on the screen, is a bidirectional process of taking basic science through to work in the community. And this includes moving research back and forth between preclinical research to all levels of clinical trials, and then into practice and back again. Excuse me. The spectrum is one model that demonstrates the ability of science to self-correct, moving treatments into and out of each phase as they pass or fail. Eventually, we want to reach the T4 spectrum, where scientific output is creating new standards of care and clinical practice and reducing healthcare disparities. However, there is one level of translational science that's missing from this chart, what we call the T5 level of translational science, which focuses on that final step, moving practice into policy. Much of my career in translational science has focused on work at the T4 and T5 levels of translation, or helping research get into the hands of policymakers so that they can act on it. Translational science as a whole focuses on the challenges and facilitators to moving from T0 to T5. I personally would add that this is explicitly excluding the challenges in finding funding. Some of the things that we ask are what or who were the obstacles that researchers encountered along the way, or what or who helped move that research along. CTSAs, or Clinical Translational Science awardees, are the primary locus for translational research and translational science. The CTSA program began in 2006 with just 12 awardees as part of the National Center for Research Resources. NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, was officially designated as its own center within the NIH in 2011. In the map on the screen, there are more than 60 CTSA hubs, and more hubs are joining every year. NCATS provided more than $629 million in funding to CTSAs in 2023. Excuse me. Under NCATS, CTSAs have a mission for developing new approaches, technologies, resources, and models, demonstrating their usefulness, and then disseminating the data, analysis, and methodologies to the community. These hubs work together with investigators, communities, and each other to improve the translation of research into treatment, practice, and policy. CTSAs are designed to develop innovative solutions that will improve the efficiency, quality, and impact of the process for turning observations in the laboratory, clinic, and community into interventions that improve the health of individuals in the. So let's dive into an example from my own research, shall we? The Weiss Indiana COVID-19 Rapid Response Team was an effort between the Indiana CTSI and the Indiana Family Social Services Administration to draw on the vast network of local experts at Indiana's leading academic institutions to provide the most crucial updates to protect public health during the pandemic. State leadership would ask a question about the pandemic, whether that was related to the effectiveness of masking and social distancing, or the best way to improve vaccine uptake, or really anything in between. This usually happened on a Friday night about 8 p.m., with a response needed no later than Sunday afternoon, so that the evidence could be evaluated by the state health commissioner, the governor, and the rest of the COVID-19 pandemic response team at the state. The WISE Indiana team would work with our partners at the Ruth Lilly Medical Library to create an annotated bibliography that summarized the best evidence available. Evidence was drawn from popular media, academic journal preprints, articles accepted for publication, and those articles that were already in circulation. 2020 was really the Wild West for publication review and acceptance. Because there was just so much that we didn't know for certain about COVID-19, we had to draw from all of these sources that were not kind of that final accepted and in print, either in an actual print journal or online for publication. So each librarian that we worked with would pull the relevant articles and create the annotated bibliography. The WISE Indiana team would review that annotated bibliography and create a summary of the evidence. So we all had to learn a whole lot about a lot of different things, including genetics and drug development and things like that, kind of on the fly. We would identify an expert on the topic and ask them to review the available evidence and provide their own expert opinion on that evidence. So experts were anyone from pulmonologists to experts in education. It really depended on the topic. They would make a final recommendation based upon their experience and the evidence that we gathered. And then we would then provide that response and recommendation to state leadership. That included up to the governor's office. State leadership would use that information to make an informed decision about the pandemic response. At the end of 2020, we also implemented the same process on more of a micro scale to continuously update the frequently asked questions for the COVID-19 vaccine. We worked with experts to pre-populate some answers to common questions that were already floating around. And then for the next 6 months, we would respond daily to new questions from the public about the COVID-19 vaccines. And then we would make major updates as new vaccines became available, new age groups were added to the eligibility pool, and new potential side effects were identified. WISE's rapid response team is a prime example of translation because we were taking the best available evidence from the laboratory, the clinic, and the community into a major public health intervention. It's also a prime example of translational science because we were constantly assessing our process for providing responses, identifying the best way to ensure that the most accurate guidance made it into the hands of decision makers. Some other examples of translational work in action include certification, which is a human research protections training program, which is similar to city certification, but that is designed particularly for community research partners instead of for researchers. So it focuses more on informed consent and protection of PHI instead of a lot of training focusing on some of the missteps that we have made in human research in the past. ENACT is a HIPAA compliant tool used by clinical researchers to conduct disease and condition-based electronic health record research across a network of more than 142 million patients. The Trial Innovation Network helps with clinical trial planning, recruitment, recruitment feasibility assessments, cohort discovery through the EHR, standardized agreements, and also provides a single site IRB review for all sites. So that means that all of the sites that are participating have agreed to have one site serve as the IRB, which takes a while to kind of set up. But once you have that set up, then any modifications that you need to make, you only have to make one time. You don't have to make that IRB modification across 100 or 200 different institutions. Another thing that we do in translational science is pull together community engagement advisory boards, which are vital ambassadors for academic health research. They can help relate the importance of scientific research to their communities in different ways and in a variety of settings, which helps increase the trust in research. Community engagement advisory boards are comprised of both academic health researchers and community leaders and encompass faith-based organizations, grassroots and large-scale nonprofits and NGOs, higher education and research institutions, as well as healthcare settings. Both the New Normal and Research Match are matchmaking portals between researchers and participants. So the former is looking for volunteers to champion healthcare causes, and the latter is looking to match participants with researchers. So now that we've talked about what translational work is, let's talk a little bit about how anthropology and translational science can work together and build fulfilling careers outside of that kind of traditional tenure track faculty path. First, we have to talk about team science. Team science is the thought process behind the increasingly interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research teams. This is reflected in calls for interdisciplinary proposals across the research funding spectrum, including the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes for Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as other funders. The underlying premise here the underlying premise of interdisciplinarity is that researchers from different backgrounds to tackle problems differently. No big surprise there, right? An anthropologist, for example, is going to respond to a problem differently than an engineer, a healthcare provider, or a politician. Under team science, we can all come together to reach a solution that addresses more of the problem than if we try to tackle a problem separately from our own silos. So what are some, but I'm not going to be able to touch upon kind of all of the different ways that an anthropologist can get involved in translation. Let's start with talking about human-centered design. Human-centered design is an approach to problem solving that develops solutions by involving the human perspectives in all steps of the problem-solving process. I'm going to take a moment here and say the definition of human-centered design is a little duh. As I was first getting involved in this research, I had a difficult time wrapping my head around this definition of human-centered design. Because if you're gonna be solving problems for people, you should probably involve the people in the problem-solving process, right? And yet that doesn't always seem to happen. And I think we've all heard stories of research teams who go to solve a problem and fail because they fail to take context into account. Human-centered design focuses on small interventions and solving the right problems. So it's really a truly collaborative approach, which brings researchers and research participants together to ensure that the research design matches the actual need. Human-centered design teams often host focus group-like sessions called jams that provide an open space for people to gather and discuss a single topic without specific direction. which helps bring to the surface more of a deep knowledge that defined questions don't often have. Potential job titles for human-centered design-focused work include user experience designer, user experience researcher, product manager, program manager, etc. Another area of clinical and translational work that might be a great fit for an anthropologist is human research participant protection roles within clinical research coordination. So this type of position bridges the gap between researchers and research participants, ensuring really that all necessary protections are in place for clinical research participants. A clinical research coordinator is the most common job title for this type of position, with varying levels of seniority attached. Clinical research coordinators are typically the main person that a research participant would engage with for the duration of their participation. They may meet with the study PI, but they won't be doing that regularly. Clinical research coordinators maintain a deep knowledge of the research protocol and ensure that all participants have, or all researchers have met their training requirements in accordance with the federal, university, and other regulations. They cooperate with compliance and monitoring efforts and ensure the project stays in compliance. So they're often in regular contact with the Office of Sponsored Projects. They help with the preparation of both the proposal and the budget, and just in general, that the study goes from an idea to a completed study, both on time and on budget. Human research protection rules also ensure that all guidelines for protected health information, or PHI, are being followed. They complete additional training regarding the access, use, and disclosure of PHI, and cooperate with compliance and monitoring efforts specifically related to PHI. They're also responsible for working with the PI to promptly report any unanticipated problems involving risk to research participants to the IRB. Biostatisticians use their quantitative skills to team with experts in other fields such as biologists, cancer specialists, surgeons, and other healthcare providers to design studies that ensure that both enough data and the right kind of data are collected. They then analyze, evaluate, and interpret the results for the PI, accounting for variables, biases, and missing data along the way. Anthropologists, particularly bioanthropologists, are already doing these types of analyses. We're just answering different questions with the data. And health informatics is really almost a combination of human-centered design and information technology. Health informatics professionals use data to improve and innovate within the healthcare system. This includes improving patient portals, centralizing medical records, and integrating the electronic health record with existing systems in a way that improves healthcare delivery. The passage of the Affordable Care Act required healthcare institutions transition to a fully digital medical record system to ensure that patients could easily bring their medical records with them when they move between healthcare providers. This also enabled healthcare providers within the same healthcare system to access all of a patient's medical records within one place. So a major part of health informatics is ensuring that the different EHR systems, because we know that there are different EHR systems and they're all operated by different companies, are able to talk to each other when a patient moves between the different systems. Health informatics teams also work with healthcare entities to develop online patient portals that are easy for patients to navigate and understand. Health informatics teams also help solve major data problems in healthcare, such as how do we track and report all of the pertinent epidemics and pandemics. So all of the major COVID-19 data dashboards were all developed by health informatics teams. An emerging area for health informatics, kind of like all fields, is the use of big data and AI to develop predictive medicine models to identify who might get sick, when, and how to best intervene. Our health informatics team at CCTS also wanted me to make sure that I shared with you all that our team also works with clinicians who are doing research to identify disease cohorts within the EHR and scrape the patient data for clinicians to utilize in research and grant applications and in clinical trial recruitment. Finally, we get to where I'm currently working in translational science, which is evaluation and continuous quality improvement. To put it simply, evaluation is the systematic process to determine merit, worth, value, or significance. Evaluations are used to monitor progress, for program improvement purposes, to formulate new policy, or for designing new programs. As an institution, we receive millions of dollars of support from the NIH and our university, and we are required and expected to account for how we utilize those funds and share with both organizations the impact of that funding. And perhaps surprisingly, because my background is in bioarchaeology, my focus is actually in qualitative evaluation and continuous quality improvement. As a qualitative evaluator, I work with the investigators that CCTS supports through the provision of services such as health informatics, clinical research coordination, and biostatistics, and or to whom we've provided funding and financial support. My role is really to learn about value that our support provided to investigators in ensuring that their research is able to make it through the stages of translation from bench to bedside to community and ultimately, hopefully, to policy. My role is also about storytelling and impact, or put more simply, how do we understand the impact that we're having as a center that really can't be achieved through looking at numbers? Finally, my role is transitioning to include a large continuous quality improvement component. As a field, we're moving from proving that the work that we're doing is meaningful. It is, we've proved that. And moving doing more of the short cycles of operational change and evaluation to determine how we can make translational science better. How can we get more innovation into policy and practice sooner? How can we work with investigators to create more impact? How can we create more community and stakeholder engagement to increase buy-in? And how can we shorten timeframes for medical innovation? Because healthcare is changing. We have better treatments and cures for disease. We're getting better at treating whole people instead of symptoms. And we are starting to actually take culture into account, which isn't to say that healthcare is perfect. It's still human. So how did I go from a PhD in bioarchaeology to a translational scientist? My BA, my MA anthropology, and I didn't really pick up any particular technical specifications along the way, although I did minor in French as an undergrad. For me, it really came down to work experience and also some serendipity. I was hired on as a student worker at the Nevada Institute for Children's Research and Policy, which is part of the School of Public Health here at UNLV, in the spring of 2016 to assist with survey implementation. I continued on as a GA for NICREP for fall 2016 and spring 2017 to conduct telephone surveys, assist in data entry and data analysis, and I started report writing. I was finally brought in as a research assistant at 80% FTE in summer 2017 and at 97.5% FTE in 2019 to really do a little bit of everything, both quantitative and qualitative evaluations, focus groups, surveys, interviews, report writing, etc. And I was able to stay on board with NCREF during the early pandemic. So I had a lot of on-the-job training in all of this work that I've been doing. I accepted a full-time position with WISE Indiana at IU in the summer of 2020. After conducting my first interview the day that Steve Sisolak announced the stay-at-home order. I heard nothing about the position for more than 2 months as the Indiana CTSI navigated the hiring freeze implemented by IU, but I was finally able to start at IU in July of 2020 and moved from Nevada to Indiana in August of 2020. If you can avoid moving during the middle of a global pandemic, I would highly recommend it.
Yeah.
At WISE Indiana, I was able to flex both my scientific writing and program design muscles because I was able to implement more than 30 full-scale evaluation projects during my 3 years at WISE. Working with WISE was an opportunity to both expand and grow my capacity in research administration. I worked on projects related to the entire scope of health and human services with any number of different research designs. And then most recently, I moved to the University of Illinois, Chicago in the fall of 2023 to narrow my focus into program evaluation and CQI, which is enabling me to become a bit more specialized in my work for the future. With that, I want to say thank you both to UNLV's anthropology department for extending an offer for me today to present this talk. It's really great to be back and not something I would have thought about in 2013 when I was doing my own pro-sem as a student. But also, I'd like to thank my home institution for allowing me the flexibility to share this information with you. Are there any questions?
I will get us started. I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. Do you think that the kind of work that you do requires a PhD, or can anyone with a lesser degree get involved in any of the aspects of the work that you do?
I would say that it absolutely does not require a PhD. Many of my colleagues have master's degrees, and many of them, particularly in biostatistics and in health informatics, have bachelor's degrees. So a PhD really isn't necessary at all.
I have a question too. I'm not stepping on anybody.
I know,
Yeah.
so don't bother.
Amber, thank you so much for the presentation. This was great. Amber was also kind enough to give a presentation on a similar topic for undergraduates in the department last spring. So I appreciate you doing this again with focus on the graduate training. I'm curious if you can maybe talk a little bit about what your own relationship is like with institutional and academic anthropology now in your current role. And specifically, I'm thinking about like how important is it for somebody who maybe has a background in anthropology, has moved into translational science to still be involved in things like going to association meetings. You mentioned that a lot of the translational science jobs are still in some ways associated with a university or college such as yours. Is that kind of valued in that position to sort of maintain that, I guess, connection to basic research, for lack of a better term?
Yes, absolutely. So I engage a lot in doing these types of talks with previous universities that I've been affiliated with. Nick, I've talked for one of your classes. I've given a similar type of presentation to UIndy where I got my master's degree. I also am working with our CCTS to develop a similar type of talk that is more is a little bit more open in scope, but to give to our own anthropology department, because one of the major things that we are trying to do is encourage more, we call it at UIC, our campus is split between the West Loop and the East Loop, or the South Loop, really. So we call it East Campus and West Campus, and all of the medical stuff is on West Campus, and we're a little bit disconnected. And so our goal is to get more of the social sciences and liberal arts to work with CCTS to allow us to do translational science that's a little bit different than what we've been doing. And our hope kind of as this organization of CTSAs as a huge collaboration is that we can get more social sciences engaged in working with CTSAs to conduct research. Because we know how hard it can be and how difficult it can be to get funding for some of the types of work that we do, that the PIs are kind of like maybe one of a handful of people who are doing all of the work of a major research project that may have hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars in funding. So our hope is to start to provide that type of support. There's been some talk of doing additional travel to some of the major national anthropology conferences, like the AAAs over the next couple of years. Personally, I've never stopped being interested in anthropology and bioarchaeology, so I still attend some of the regional conferences for archaeology here in the Midwest on a somewhat regular basis. So I like to think that I still have my toes in the community, although I think that I could be better about that as well.
I have a question. Great talk. I learned a lot about translational science. I really wasn't even sure. I didn't even know this was a thing. As also a bioarchaeologist, I think one of the things that I struggle with in my work is the reason I do it is because I do feel deeply about health disparities in the world, and especially where I focus on in terms of urbanization and health. One question I always get asked is, so why do you, how does it really matter? In our publications, our grants, it's always like, oh, people are suffering from this thing and we're going to use bioarchaeology to solve the problem and save the day, like superheroes, right? So as a bioarchaeologist in this position, what are your experiences, working with scientists from similar backgrounds who have maybe had success in translating their science to policy and community engagement? And what are some recommendations you could make to those of us who are still very squarely stuck in the past with our sort of interest and expertise? Like, how can we be better about engaging with those communities and engaging with, public policy and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there are a couple of things from our perspective as anthropologists that we can do. First, I think, is to really narrow down kind of what that big picture message that you're trying to send about how important the work that you're doing is. I know as a bioarchaeologist, our work is really rooted in the past, but a lot of the times we have to look back in the past to start to look towards the future. So for me, my own research ended up being a lot about how migration is a strategy to mitigate the impacts of really unstable changing environments, both from a climate perspective, but also from a geopolitical perspective. And I think if you can kind of narrow down that message of why is the work that you're doing really important, and make a parallel to something that's really important today, that's really helpful. Another strategy as an anthropologist is identifying those people within the research community that have strong relationships with the people who make policy. And I'm not saying here that by people that make policy, I'm not necessarily thinking about your senators or your congressmen or your state senators or your state representatives, but the people who are working in state government to translate what the law says that they have to do into the policy of that program. Those are the people who are the most concerned about what the actual evidence says. Those are the people who you want to connect with to say, hey, this is what the evidence is. So part of those 30 projects that I worked on with WISE Indiana was connecting this policymakers within the Indiana Family Social Services Administration to the people who are the top experts in that particular field in Indiana. And it gave them a pipeline to say, hey, here's what the expert research said. Like, here's what like the whole of this field is saying is the most important right now. And put it directly into the hands of those policymakers who often either don't have the time, the inclination, or the experience to dive into, or the access to dive into the scientific literature to find out what that is. They rely on experts like us to make those decisions. There is a network of state university partnerships called SUPLN. It's SUPLN. And most of the states in the country have a SUPLN partner network that is a connection between a university and a state agency. And that is a really great way by connecting your SUPLN partnership to start to put that research into the hands of policymakers. Did that answer your question?
Oh, definitely.
So kind of building off of that also, bioarchaeology, the more I know a lot of people who have gone into the private sector from bioarch, and we are incredibly relevant. And I think of Amber, this is more from a personal conversation with us. But do you remember that time you were working on lead poisoning and you were talking in a meeting and you were like, oh no, I can tell you what it does to bones. And you told them and they were like, we did not know that, right? And so these, a lot of what we do, because we know what it looks like, there's something about when you tell people it's on the skeleton that completely changes how they view a disease. And they're like, and I'm like, and I regularly bring up like, and someone will see this 1,000 years from now. And they're like, oh. And so that's another thing I think that as a bioarch, you brought to the table that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's really relevant for all of anthropology, and kind of bringing into these other research spaces. And it's also a demonstration of why interdisciplinarity is so important. Why it is important to have research teams to tackle a problem that are coming at it from a different background. Because, for example, when thinking about lead poisoning and childhood lead poisoning, we know that lead is a problem. But I think there is, in some circles, not in all circles, a focus on why it is a problem right now for children. But thinking about, okay, well, lead mimics calcium, and calcium is a neurotransmitter, and that is why lead is a neurotoxin. But lead also mimics calcium, and it is deposited in the skeleton. And then during pregnancy or advanced aging and osteoporosis, as the skeleton is experiencing resorption, that lead gets then released back into the bloodstream. And so newborns and fetuses can experience elevated blood lead levels, and so can adults of advanced age. So it's just like important things to think about that maybe don't necessarily always cross in other disciplines. It's not what their focus is on. The focus is on the intervention, not other questions.
It's about certification, that is CIRT to substitute the city training.
Yes.
Is that through the university or Indiana University, this training, or is another is an alternative for the city training?
It is an so CCTS, where I'm at now, worked to we sponsored the development of certification. But certification is available, it's an online training that is available through UIC CCTS's website. We have users from around the globe. We have currently, I think, 7,000, almost 7,000 community partners who have taken the training since it was launched virtually in 2021, 2022. It is not a substitution for city training, but for researchers, but for community research partners who don't necessarily need to have the background, it can be a suitable alternative. It is still something that UNLV's IRB would have to approve that you use alternatively to city training. But it has been fairly successfully used by a number of different institutions across the country in lieu of city for IRB purposes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'm sorry, I can't see behind Nick.
I have one also.
Sure.
I would you talk a little bit more about, since translational science is still very new to me, but the closest thing I can compare it to, which you also mentioned for the different types of human-centered design positions, is UX designers, US research. And my sense is from talking to people who have left academia and do more of that work, that there are almost kind of, I don't know a better word for it, but sort of like tiers of employment within the UX world. Some jobs are more, limited contract based, and sort of when the 6 months or whatever is up, you're sort of off there looking for employment elsewhere, and others are, more of a full-time, almost like equivalent to a tenured position at a university. Is there like a similar sort of a division of labor and types of job titles for translational science? That makes sense?
Yes and no. It depends on the institution. So at CCTS, there are, for example, my position is senior research specialist. There are other just like regular or assistant research specialists. So because a lot of the CTSAs where a lot of the translational science work goes on are often I think almost exclusively they're at universities, and almost exclusively they're in colleges or schools of medicine. The position title tends to be very similar to what you would expect with tenure track faculty. At UIC, I am research professional. I'm a research professional staff member. At IU, I was non-tenure track faculty. But I was on the scholar track, not the teaching track. So there are different kind of ways people approach what your position would be. There really, I think, the opportunity for like different levels of like the associate, assistant, full, but kind of with different ways you would designate that.
Great.
So I have a question that's probably something that matters more to the students, but what's the pay range? Pay range, because I know already, but for their information, pay range and work-life balance.
Yeah. So I almost put this in the slide show to answer these questions because I expected them. But I'm a public employee. My pay rate is public knowledge, public information. I just got a little bit of a raise, but my annual compensation is $91,800.
Oh, now.
In addition, I was gonna say, in addition to that, because you also talked about work-life balance.
Yeah.
Uh,
Good to me.
uh, my university provides a 10% salary match. I think it's 10% at UIC. It was at IU, to my retirement accounts. So they don't match what I put in. It's an automatic 10% match of my salary, on an annual basis. As a public employee of the state of Illinois, much like for NSHE team members, I also have a state pension that I pay into and that the university also pays into. And then, and I think this might be the kicker for people when talking about work-life balance, is that I get 24 days of paid vacation time every year. That does not include any extra additional gift days. Our university is closed from Christmas Eve to New Year's Day, without having to take any PTO. And then I start out with a bank of 15 sick days per year, and I can accumulate more. We are regularly harassed by our leadership if we don't take all of our PTO. So for example, I was off for almost all of the month of July because I needed to take my PTO. So they definitely encourage you to take your PTO in whatever way that's meaningful for you. If that's taking it all at one time, or if you want to have every Friday off during the summer, or however that works. So they definitely encourage that strong work-life balance. But if you think back to my talking about the COVID-19 rapid response team, that isn't necessarily always the case. Like I said, we got a lot of those requests for evidence at like 8 or 9 p.m. on a Friday evening. And it was then a drop everything and get that going and recruit a faculty member who was also willing to do work on the weekends. But because of the pandemic, it was a lot of people were willing to do that to ensure that the state was implementing evidence-based policies and practices.
So for the sake of information, and predictably, benefits and pay are much higher in the private sector, right? So I have a friend who works at Teladoc. He has a PhD in anthropology and works as a senior user experience design researcher. He makes north of 200,000 a year and has unlimited paid time off. Yeah, I don't really fully understand the unlimited thing either, but he uses it, right? So he takes months off each year, and as long as he's doing his projects, he maintains.
Yeah, it's not getting the projects done.
You still have to live it.
You know, I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but if meaningful, then you know there is opening there. It's an opportunity.
And I think part of, for me, Like there is the balance in knowing that outside of the academia and the private sector usually does pay more. I say usually, it almost always pays more, if we're being honest. But there is a lot of predictability in working for a university. There's a lot of, like, I have a contract that I sign every year as a measure of employment. Really excellent healthcare benefits and retirement benefits, and some private companies also offer those, but they don't really have to, unlike a public university. So the pay may be a little bit less, but the benefits for me also, as far as work-life balance and predictability, are very good.
You also have to consider how many student loans do you have? Because if you're a public sector,
Yeah.
Oh, loan forgiveness.
Yes.
Forgiveness.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that. My mom will do that.
yeah.
Yeah.
For now.
For 20 years.
Current administration.
Oh, yeah, I have some too.
It's a lot of that.
I won't share that last number with you guys. That's private.
No, that's perfect.
But yes, it does qualify for public service loan forgiveness, as far as we know.
In that same vein, what is the dental, what is the medical? Okay, because I'm on the other side, but if you got any openings right now?
Yeah.
So do you pay into Social Security because some places don't? And what is the retirement age in your organization? Because that is something
She's ready.
Don't think about it until they really want to, or it's time to, and they haven't prepared for it or whatnot. So what's the medical and dental coverage? Do you pay into Social Security? Because if you don't, then you need to make sure you got another stream of income. And what's the retirement age?
All right. So I'm going to start with the Social Security thing. As a pensioned employee, I pay into the state pension plan. I don't pay into Social Security. I have paid into Social Security in the past, and I assume that I will pay into Social Security in the future. As far as retirement age, there is no set age for retirement. It's based upon length of service. So you have to have a certain length of service to be eligible for retirement from UIC. I believe that is 20 to 25 years. At least to start being able to start drawing on your pension. As far as medical and dental, we have a number of choices. Even what I consider to be really excellent coverage, teeth are still considered luxury bones, as I like to joke. So dental insurance is more of a discount than quote unquote an insurance. But it is covers all of your preventative every year, and will also cover up to a certain amount of like filling of caries or other like restorative work. Again, with healthcare, we have several different options. All of them include vision. Part of the Affordable Care Act implementation is that there are a number of different options. My healthcare needs are more complex than your average person. I have a chronic illness and a disability. I need to see a number of specialists on an annual basis, so I opt for the higher coverage amount. My deductible I've already met for the year, which runs from July 1 to June 30. I've already met. And my premiums are, I think, about in line with most of the universities that I've worked for as high coverage option or low deductible, high coverage option, which is about $500 a month for me and my spouse. So I think that they're fairly average, but I consider the healthcare coverage to be excellent, and access to providers to be excellent. Options may vary depending on where you go. My options in Indiana were very different than my options in Nevada and my options in Illinois.
We're a minute over, so I think we'll get Amber back the rest of her day. Thank you so much.
You can say if you want to. If you want to.
Not her looking it up for you.
I would say thank you again for having me. Nick and Alicia have my contact information if you have any more questions. I would be happy to answer them. And I have time to stick around if you guys do. You all do.
Might need to give the room to whoever then use it next, but I'll be sure to share your contact info.
Great.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.